On the 11th of June, the British public went to the polls and re-elected Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party in a third successive landslide victory. While the majority was reduced a little from the devastating win in 1983, Mrs Thatcher could still command a 50-seat majority, while the centrist third party, the Liberal SDP Alliance, once again polled 22% of the vote but only won 3% of the seats. One former leader of the SDP and former Labour cabinet minister Roy Jenkins lost his seat, as did author and broadcaster Clement Freud and controversial former Conservative minister Enoch Powell. The day after the election, President Reagan made a long-planned state visit to West Berlin and made a speech that received little press coverage at the time. Standing at the Brandenburg Gate in front of the Berlin Wall, he challenged the Soviet leader,
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall,
and called for an end to the arms race. Across the world in New Zealand, the Parliament passed an act declaring the island nation a nuclear-free zone, not only banning nuclear weapons and power plants from the country, including those in visiting ships, but also committing New Zealand to campaigning for nuclear non-proliferation on the world stage. Anti-nuclear sentiment in New Zealand had been at an all-time high since the sinking in 1985 of the Greenpeace ship Rainbow Warrior by French Secret Service agents in Auckland Harbour. In the US, Bernie Goetz was exonerated on 12 of 13 counts arising from his shooting in 1984 of 4 young black men on the New York subway. The one charge on which he was convicted was that of carrying a loaded, unlicensed weapon in a public place, for which he served 8 months. The controversy over his actions was, of course, reignited, with considerations of racism and vigilantism on one side set against self-defence and the proliferation of crime on the other. And racing driver Henri Pescarolo, along with his friend Air France pilot Patrick Fortique and their crew, entered the record books by flying around the world in 88 hours and 48 minutes. They flew in a World War II-era Lockheed Lodestar aircraft, beating a record set in the same type by Howard Hughes in 1938, in his case of just over 91 hours. The F1 teams arrived in an increasingly tatty-looking Detroit, a city that more than most reflected the perceived urban decay of 1980s America. In fact, the forthcoming movie RoboCop, which would be released in a few weeks' time, set its biting satire of corporate capitalism in Detroit, though ironically it was filmed in another former F1 venue, Dallas. The teams hated Detroit, the drivers hated it, the locals seemed largely apathetic, and coming in the calendar directly after Monaco just served to emphasise the differences. Alain and Prost spoke for many. I hate it here, the track is a joke. We race here simply because it's in America where everyone says we must race. I agree with that, but this place gives America no idea what Formula One is really like. There are some great tracks here, Watkins Glen for instance. Why don't we use one of those and make everybody happy? Nelson Piquet was in full agreement for once. He hated Detroit for all the same reasons he hated Monaco, but at least he lived in Monaco and could just pop home afterwards. In the 3 weeks since Monaco, the teams had been busy. Brabham had lost designer David North to McLaren and engineer John Gentry to Benetton. Honda had made some modifications to their engines for both Williams and Lotus, and the latter team also had a new 5.5-inch carbon fibre clutch to help engine response on the tight street circuit. Ferrari had done likewise, though theirs was a 7.5-inch model instead, as Lotus had an exclusive on the shorter one. Ford, meanwhile, had made some major improvements to their V6 turbo units and electronics after both drives were plagued by significant turbo lag in Monaco. And despite the promised new car, Ligier also continued to tweak the current model, doing some wind tunnel work at Saint-Cyr and redesigning the radiator inlets. The tradition of slightly chaotic organisation, despite this being the 6th running of the Detroit Grand Prix, was in evidence again as the first practice session started late and the organisers were fined $20,000 by FISA. As in Monaco, there's no way to test on the Detroit circuit outside race weekends, so the practice sessions are vital, and there were a number of shunts, luckily none too serious, as drivers found the limits of the circuit, their machines and themselves. Both Brabham drivers, Brundle, Nakajima, Fabi, Campos and Berger all kept their engineers busy rebuilding bent cars as the weekend went on. But when the dust had settled, it was once again Mansell on pole with Senna alongside, the Red 5 Williams being the first ever to lap the circuit in less than 1 minute 40. In third was Nelson Piquet, who may have hated the place but could certainly drive it, alongside Thierry Boutsen in the much improved Benetton, his career best grid position. Prost was fifth, complaining of a lack of grip, alongside home driver Eddie Cheever, keeping his sponsor US F&G insurers happy. Less happy were Ferrari, with Alboreto 7th and Berger 12th, and an unwell Fabi in the second Benetton was 8th, Patrese 9th, and Warwick in the other arrows, rounding out the top 10. Stefan Johansson was 11th, also finding no grip, with Palmer and Streff the top non-turbos in 13th and 14th, lining up ahead of the two Zach speeds, with the disgruntled Brundle having had an engine fire and a shunt preventing him from getting the most out of his new, more responsive Zach speed engine. The Ligiers were still adrift, and Detroit first-timers Nakajima, Campos and Fabre all brought up the rear. It rained on Saturday night and most of the way through morning warm-up, but by race time it had dried off and the sun was even starting to peek through. The CBS coverage was doing its best to hype up the event for a traditionally indifferent American audience.
Road courses. High tech. Glamour. Life in the fast lane. And danger. Space-age racing machines manned by drivers of 11 nations. Thrilling aficionados in 16 countries.
Focusing on the chance of Alain Prost getting his record-breaking 28th win, with Jackie Stewart again on hand to wish him all the best. But Prost had never won in Detroit and was personally playing down his chances, unhappy with car and circuit. The parade lap went off without a problem, and despite the weather there was actually a sizable crowd out to watch proceedings. Starter Roland Brunscheider pressed the button, the lights went green and away they went, with Mansell leading Senna away, followed by Piquet and Cheever, who'd got a great start from 6th. Nakajima, starting near the back in the camera car, clipped the back of Capelli's march and caught some air, and a few corners later was airborne again as Campos returned the favour. The Japanese driver was out, his first DNF of the year. Satoru's teammate Senna, meanwhile, was stuck to the back of Mansell's Williams like a sweaty t-shirt as they finished lap 1, with Piquet a little way back, then Cheever, Fabi, Alboreto, Prost having dropped back to 7th, with Boutsen 8th after a poor start. Cheever was feeling lively, harassing Piquet and passing under braking as the Brazilian started feeling the effects of a slow puncture caused by running over a bit of carbon fibre left on the track from Nakajima's eventful lap. Behind them, Alboreto and Fabi were also having a lively scrap over 5th as Nelson came in for new tyres and emerged right at the back as Capelli and Caffey came past, though the latter soon had one of the odder retirements when his gear lever came off in his hand. Up front, Mansell began to pull away from Senna, and they were both leaving Cheever far behind in 3rd, who had a small gap to the pack led by Fabi and Alboreto. Teo managed to get away from the Ferrari and start to attack Cheever instead, while Michele now had to worry about Prost behind him. Soon enough, Fabi was right on Cheever's gearbox and looking for a way past, but in his impatience to get past the arrows, he made a rather optimistic manoeuvre into turn 3 and lost his nose, giving the innocent Cheever a puncture into the bargain. Both came into pit, with Cheever underway with new boots on in 19th and a lap down, but Fabi's race was over. The mountings had come away too, and there was no way of fitting a new nose. Fabi got out to have a look for himself and was immediately nobbled by the CBS pit lane reporter.
Teo, what happened?
Well, Cheever was very slow, but he didn't want to let me by, so I had a little accident.
So that put Alboreto 3rd, while Boutsen had made his way past Prost during all the excitement too, and all the while Mansell continued tearing away at the front, and Piquet had made his way up to 13th by lap 10, and was probably enjoying Detroit even less than he usually did. The field was stringing out by now, but there was still some close racing between Alboreto and Boutsen over 4th, and the pair were beginning to gain on Senna, who was having some brake problems and had backed off to the tune of 3 seconds a lap. Derek Warwick sideswiped a wall off camera and came in with his right rear at a distinctly unnatural angle. The Arrows crew made a valiant attempt to fix it, but the suspension was broken and Delboy was out. Alboreto had gotten away from Boutsen once more, who was now concentrating on Prost and Berger in his mirrors, and Nelson Piquet was up to 9th and shaping up to pass his Brabham replacement and former teammate Riccardo Patrese. The pair caught Johansson, who was suffering the same misfire that had plagued him at Monaco, and Piquet passed Patrese just before they both went by the Swede, so Piquet was now up to 7th and just outside the points. Brundle came into the pits and had a sudden flame out in his turbocharger, which filling the pits with extinguisher fumes, as further up the pit Johansson came in for a new nose and to have his engine looked at. His weekend already ruined, there wasn't much he could do except sit in his cockpit and wait, while Brundle was sent off only to expire at the pit lane exit. At least it was a short walk back. By about 1/3 distance, Prost had got ahead of Boots and was clambering all over Alboreto, who showed no inclination to make life easy for the champion, and soon they were joined by 5th-place Berger, just in time for Alboreto to miss a gear, letting both through at the end of lap 25. The number 27 Ferrari dropped rapidly back, having in fact not missed a gear, but busted his gearbox, and he was soon pulling over to retire, promoting Piquet into the points. Nelson wasn't hanging about either, and quickly disposing of Boutsen started reeling in Prost and Berger. Mansell was the first of the major runners to make a scheduled tyre stop at the end of lap 34 out of 64, by which time he had a lead of about 18 seconds over Senna. A sticking right rear tyre cost him almost exactly that, though, and he rejoined third just behind Prost. Senna's crew were out too, and the Brazilian's lead over Mansell was 22 seconds, which should be enough if nothing went wrong in the Lotus pit. But Ayrton was feeling good with the car and stayed out, while Mansell was on a charge on his new tyres, setting a new fastest lap of 1 minute 40.5 seconds, which would have put him second on the grid. Off camera, he passed Prost to take second. Alain promptly came in for tyres, and also had a sticky wheel and a slow stop, as Alliot stuffed his Lola into a wall, but Mansell was by now having a severe cramp in his right leg, made more severe by having had to hold the brake down for so long at his stop, and began dropping back from Senna. Meanwhile, Piquet had made his way up to fourth and was right behind Prost as they lapped Streff and Fabre and nipped through at the chicane to take third. Streff's Tyrrell shed a wheel on lap 47, prompting memories of the tragic accident at Indy 500 the previous month, but fortunately everyone missed the stray tyre, including Senna, who came through now 46 seconds ahead of an ailing Mansell, who had his teammate Piquet right behind him. While the cameras watched Senna circulating in the lead, coming up to lap local boy Cheever, now back up to sixth, Mansell waved Piquet past, and Prost came through as well, and a few laps later the cameras also missed Berger taking fourth from Mansell. Senna lapped Mansell in the closing laps, Nigel probably just grateful at this point to have one fewer lap to drive, but Senna went the full 63 laps on one set of tyres to win his second race in a row, become the first man ever to win in Detroit twice, and take the championship lead, crossing the line just ahead of a lapped Johansson. In the second place, just as in Monaco, was Nelson Piquet after a fine comeback drive, coincidentally second by almost exactly the same margin of 33 seconds, with Prost third. Berger driving an unspectacular but solid race for 3 points, Mansell's reward for his persistence was 2, and Cheever picked up the last point after a good comeback drive of his own. Johansson was 7th and dropped to 4th in the standings after 2 miserable races, with Danner, Patrese and Arnaud following, then Palmer the top 3.5 litre car, and Fabre, as usual, bringing up the rear but still running, and this time being promoted to second in his category after the rest of the Cosworth cars failed to finish. So Prost would have to wait yet longer for that record, but perhaps it was meant to be because the next race was at his home Grand Prix in France.